This is our SAT vocabulary list number 20. Please take Cornell notes, write the word, part of speech, and the definition, as well as any examples I say or that you think of that you think will help you remember these words. The first word is acquiesce, and it's a verb. It means to comply, to submit to somebody else's will. It means to give in without protest. So if you're having kind of a disagreement with someone and then they acquiesce, they either kind of agree to disagree or maybe they agree that you have a good point. But basically, they're kind of bowing out of the argument. They're submitting, they're complying to your will. If you imagine, some families, when parents are going through divorce, maybe they're arguing and trying to figure out, custody issues and who's going to stay in the house. And then one partner just decides to acquiesce, right? They give in. They decide, they don't want to fight. They don't want to argue anymore. They're just going to sign the paperwork or come to an agreement. 2 is appall. And it's a verb, and it means to be filled with dismay, horror, almost disgust. You cannot believe something. And so it can be at varying degrees too. So, there's some teenagers who you might see, or even younger kids, you might see your parents being affectionate with each other, and you might be kind of like appalled, like, Mom, Dad, stop, like, what are you doing? You're kind of horrified by their behavior, particularly if you had like friends around. But then there's also much more intense kind of sensations or feelings of being appalled. So every time I turn on the BBC and I hear about what's happening in the Philippines after last week's typhoon, I'm just appalled. It's like unbelievable to me that a storm, one of these superstorms, could cause such huge devastation. 3 is consensus. And if we have a consensus, that means we all agree. And the definition, it's a noun. It says a collective, unanimous opinion of a number of persons. This is a definite SAT definition. So a collective, unanimous opinion. You got a bunch of people in a room. If they all agree, then you have a consensus. So, looking at this boardroom, clearly these gentlemen are making some decisions. I'm kind of wondering where the women are at the table. But they're trying to probably decide things. But if I was to ask my classes, hey, do we want to have homework this weekend? I'm pretty sure the consensus would be, no, Miss Tucker, we do not want to have homework this weekend. I'm pretty sure that's something we could all agree on. 4 is emulate. It's a verb, and it means to imitate. And usually you're emulating someone because you think a lot of them and you love one day to be their equal or maybe even surpass them in whatever it is that they do that you think is kind of remarkable. So if you're a soccer player and you have, kind of a famous pro soccer player that you love watching, maybe you emulate them. You think about them when you're practicing. You want to be as good as them. Now, as a parent with 2 children, it's so common for siblings to also want to emulate one another, right? We emulate role models, anybody that we kind of look up to. 5 is gregarious, and this describes someone, and again, this is an SAT definition. They define gregarious as not habitually solitary or living alone. Social. So what does that mean? Not habitually solitary. You don't make a habit of being by yourself. You don't make a habit of living alone. Instead, you are very social. You love having people around if you're gregarious. You probably love to talk and interact and engage. People who are gregarious tend to be outgoing. They tend to be extroverted. So I just have a picture of people who are literally so happy to be together, it looks like they're skipping, right? They love each other's energy, each other's company. 6 is innuendo, and an innuendo is a little bit hard to describe. It's an indirect hint or an indirect statement that is made about a person or about a thing, but usually these indirect hints or these indirect statements are negative. They tend to be kind of disparaging, where you're chipping away at someone's character or you're saying something about them that is not positive. They might be kind of derogatory in terms of their nature. It's an insinuation. And when you insinuate something, you don't come right out and say it, but most people who hear what you say, they're going to know what you mean. And as a woman, the way I hear this word most often is actually with sexual innuendos, where people say things that are kind of a slightly sexual, slightly offensive nature, and they don't outright say it, so it's hard to get upset that it's been said, but they make kind of this insinuation. And so when I was thinking of this word, I was trying to imagine what could I use to kind of represent an insinuation, an innuendo, and I immediately thought of Michael from The Office. One of his taglines is, "That's what she said," and he tags it onto statements that normally would just be normal statements, but when you add that little like line onto it, it creates these kind of odd little innuendos that are usually kind of offensive in nature, particularly to the women in the office. 7 is literal. This describes something. So it's an adjective, and it describes something that follows the exact words, the exact meaning of something. So I was thinking literal translation. There's a lot of different texts that are written in different languages, and then they are translated, and the literal meaning is written in English. So here's Leo Tolstoy's very famous War and Peace, an enormous text that was translated literally, word for word, trying to give us the exact meaning of the original text from Russian into English. 8 is objective. And this is what I'm always trying to get you guys to do in your writing. So it describes someone or something that grasps and represents facts as they are. So without your personal opinion, your personal bias all mixed in. So you know what the facts are and you represent them as they are, even if you disagree with them. So in your writing, oftentimes I'll say, please maintain the objective third person. I don't want you to put the first person in and compromise your objectivity. When you're on a jury, you also have to be objective. You cannot mix in your personal feelings about the case with the facts of the case. Your cultural background, your past experiences, your gender, your age, those things shouldn't impact the facts. And so it's important to stay objective. The 9th word is prodigy, and for my sophomores, this word will sound familiar. When we were reading the Joy Luck Club last year, we read the chapter about Waverly, who is a child prodigy. She is a prodigy in chess. And so a prodigy is a person or a thing of very remarkable gifts, talents, qualities. And a prodigy, usually they kind of emerge at a young age where, a young child will just be like remarkably good at something that usually takes people years to become good at. A great example would be Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was composing musical pieces by the time he was 5 years old. Definitely a child prodigy when it came to composing and playing music. 10 is repress, and I underlined the word press to help you remember what this word means, because it's a verb, and when you repress, you literally push things down. You press them down to keep them under control, under restraint, particularly feelings. We repress a lot of feelings. Some people repress memories because they can't handle them. They don't want to deal with them. So they push them, they press them down, they press them to the back of their heads to try to maintain control. And so, kind of in a more physical way, you get like a referee and a hockey game, kind of pushing people apart, trying to kind of repress this volatile situation where these two guys might be getting in a fight. 11 is slight, and someone who is described, or something that is described as slight, is of a very small stature. So someone who's described as slight, like a person, is just a very small person. So maybe they have really delicate bone structure, maybe they're very thin. Slight can also describe something that's not a lot, it doesn't have a lot of importance, it doesn't have a lot of significance. And so it can describe a small amount of that too. So when you open up your app on your phone, so if I'm looking at this kind of description, there is some changes in the beginning of the week, but then if I'm looking at Thursday through Saturday, there's very slight change, right? It's 55 and partly sunny, 55 partly sunny, 55 mostly sunny. So there's not a big change. The change for the weather will be very slight towards the end of the week. 12 is susceptible. It describes someone or something that is easily influenced, or they say easily under a specified power, which it makes it sound almost mystical to me. If you're susceptible, you're kind of vulnerable to something. So when I think of being susceptible, I think of like getting sick. So if you're susceptible to illness, maybe it means your immune system is already compromised. And so it would be easy for you to fall under the power of like the infection that's going around or the germs that are going around. So susceptible is to be vulnerable, to go under the influence of something. Some people are very susceptible, as I said, to like germs and illness. I feel like I always get sick when my students get sick. Some people are, the teenagers are very susceptible to peer pressure. So if their friends are kind of putting pressure on them to do something, they're susceptible. They're kind of vulnerable. It's hard for them to say no. 13 is undermine. It's a verb, and it means to subvert in an underhanded kind of way. So if you undermine someone, you kind of, you don't respect their authority. You don't respect them. You kind of do what you want, and even if it means you're kind of subverting, going around, not listening to what you should be doing. So undermining authority is a great way to think about this. And when you think of under, you're kind of going under around. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're not listening to someone. This example from a classroom is a perfect example where the students, they almost look like adult students, but the students are kind of undermining. If this was an actual classroom scene where they're throwing paper airplanes, they're out of their seats, they're just being wild and crazy, they're undermining the teacher's authority. They're not respecting, they're kind of subverting and doing just whatever the heck they want instead of doing what they really should be doing. 14 is to wean. It's a verb. And it literally means, the literal meaning, is to transfer the young, a child or a young animal, from dependence on the mother's milk to some other form of nourishment. So when moms stop breastfeeding, they wean their children. But this word is also used anytime you slowly stop doing something or you slowly quit something. So some people slowly kind of wean themselves off of like cigarettes, and maybe they chew that like nicotine gum, and they're trying to get off of cigarettes because they know it's a bad habit. They're trying to wean themselves. And then so you have this literal meaning of like young and with their mothers and drinking mother's milk, and then weaning and starting to eat grass and other kinds of things. And then you have just this other more kind of figurative meaning where you're really just trying to stop something. You're trying to move away from maybe a bad habit or something that you've been doing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, like weaning yourself off cigarettes. Maybe you have a habit of eating chocolate at night, and you're trying to wean yourself off that because the caffeine makes you stay up later, it's hard for you to sleep, or you just shouldn't be having so much sugar at night. So anytime you're trying to stop something. And 15 is impervious. Something that is described as impervious is incapable of being penetrated or incapable of being affected. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking actually of the kind of hide on this kind of an animal. And if you think about the hide on a rhinoceros, it would be like almost impervious. It would be so hard to penetrate, to like do any damage because that skin is so incredibly thick. And there's lots of materials that are very impervious. It's almost impossible to penetrate them, to get into them, or to really have an effect on them. When we think about the way castles used to be built with huge walls and big moats filled with water around them, the whole point of those castles and the high walls is so they would be impervious to an attack. It would be impossible for, or hopefully impossible for, anyone to penetrate to get inside the castle walls.